Okay, my name is Kim Lovering. I'm here from the DFW area, and like you mentioned, I'm a UI engineer for Orbitz. Actually, fairly new with them. I was with Travelocity and Sabre prior to that. So today I wanted to talk about accessibility. And as the name kind of infers, there's an awful lot of times when people hear accessibility and they start to have a lot of heartburn. If you've had to deal with accessibility before, it's not necessarily the most fun part of your project. But I want to try and take a little bit of the mystery out of there. There's a lot of facets to really think about as you go through accessibility. I've gone through this a few times on big sites, and I wanted to kind of hit a few things that we see over and over again and point you to some resources. And 20 minutes is definitely not enough to cover it all, but I'll be here so you can find me. So what is web accessibility? It's pretty easy. It's just creating an environment, a website that's going to be able to be used by everybody. If you have a disability, this should not stop you from being able to use anything that's out there. So what does that really mean for us? Typically it means at the end you need to have a nice clean code base. You need to worry about if your code's validating. More than likely that anything that's not validating could get in the way of what a screen reader is trying to do. Making sure that your document structure is true to how you're presenting your actual content. Best way to look at that is just take off CSS, see how it's presented. The screen reader actually goes through and reads the content in the order that's in your code and not how you're manipulating it with CSS. So that's a big thing to think about. We're going to be adding a lot of hidden extras in there for the non-visual user to be able to add some cues for them. Most of the time, this is going to be adding in span tags with a class that we're burying some text over to the left, clipping it, and it's only there for somebody that's using a screen reader. And typically, it's actually pretty easy to implement. Once you get used to it, there's really not any great mystery to it. The biggest pain point is if you're dealing with an old code base. If you're coming from a corporate environment where you're in code that's 7 or 8 years old, tens of hundreds of people have touched the code, it's not going to be a fun process, and I definitely have felt your pain. If you're in a new project, even if there's a lot of people working on it, it's a much easier situation to be in. The company that I was just at, we had to go through and add accessibility to a very old code base. It took almost 1.5 years to be able to fully validate. We then built basically the exact same thing in an Angular project, and we were able to make it accessible in 20 days. There's a huge difference if you know what you're going to be working with when you start. So why? Really, this list should be in the opposite order, but this is how business looks at it. There's legal reasons you have to worry about this. Of course, there's the one that most people know about, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. But there's also the Airline Carriers Act, which is pretty new, and sites that carry any kind of air travel purchasing have to be accessible by the end of next year, at least in the booking path and any details about those things that you book before your flight actually takes place. And then the next year after that, the entire sites have to be accessible. And this isn't just for Travelocity and Orbitz and American Airlines sites to worry about. This is any third-party software or pieces that are on their sites. So, and if you actually have these third-party pieces, you're liable for that third-party piece along with a third-party group. So there's a lot of people here that could really get sued if you're not taking care of this. It comes down to it, you really just don't want to cut off your users either. Obviously, we're building things because we want people to use what we're doing. So why would you want to cut off a user base? So it may be small depending on what your product is. It may be big. But we don't want to cut people off. And really, the biggest reason that any of us should really want to do this is that it's kind of your moral obligation to go through and make sure that everybody can use what you're building. It's kind of the jerk factor, You shouldn't be making things that aren't accessible to everybody. And it's the same thing as building a building with a great set of stairs and you don't let anybody else use a ramp. It's really the same deal. You need to make sure that you're thinking about everybody. So one of the lines I like to use when I have to go through, especially to do an internal presentation, is that it's not only for the blind, people. A lot of times the stereotypical user that we think of for accessibility is somebody that can't, is fully blind and they're just using a screen reader or a braille reader. But you have people that are in all different kinds of situations that you have to think about. We obviously have our visual disabilities where somebody may just be low on vision or they're colorblind or they may not have any sight. We have our hearing impairments, obviously anybody that's hard of hearing or has no hearing. Our physical disabilities, you can think of just somebody that's broken an arm and can't use their main, like if I broke my right arm, I'd be terrible with my left hand trying to use a mouse. Maybe not so bad on a mobile device, but on a desktop I'd have a hard time. So if you're making me have to hit small strike points, I'm going to have a hard time doing that. And especially if I was somebody that had something like Parkinson's, if you have hoverovers, any kind of, with a mobile device, any kind of shaking that's going to create some kind of action, you've cut me out. And then there's cognitive disabilities. Typically, this gets covered in when you take care of the first 3 buckets. A lot of times, if somebody is severe enough that they need to have a couple senses used while they're doing something, they'll be using the visual browser while also using a screen reader. So they're getting input from a few different ways. Great. So now we know that we need to worry about accessibility. We don't want to get sued. That's no fun. We don't want to cut off our users, and we certainly don't want to be a jerk. So what do we need to do? There's so many pieces of this that add up to a site that actually will pass validation. Typically, when you have to go through and do any kind of accessibility work, you're going to be looking at the W3C, YCAG 2.0, level A, AA, or AAA. And this is just basically what a validator will run against. Most of the acts that I listed or talked about earlier require level AA validation. If you work with somebody like a bank, they're going to push you to the level 3 validation, which can get pretty tough. That's really tough on color contrast, and you start to see where there's a lot of design elements that you have to worry about. But I've been lucky enough, I guess you could say lucky enough, that I've dealt with a lot of banks. And the advantage of dealing with a corporate situation with a lot of banks is that they have accessibility testing groups. And the advantage of that is that I get somebody that goes through and tests our code constantly. So obviously we're getting defects and bugs all the time. And we know what we're doing. Some of these things here are so really utterly basic, but we run into issues over and over again. So I actually originally had a list of 10, but my talk was certainly not going to have the time for that. So I took down my 4 biggest things I see over and over again, and I bet you if you went out and tested some of the biggest sites out there, you're still going to find issues with some of these. Document structure. Like I mentioned earlier, screen readers are going through and actually reading your content in the order that it's in the code and not how you're presenting it. So if you're really mixing it up with your CSS, you need to realize a screen reader is not going to go in that order. It's also just a matter of making sure that your structure is just orderly. Most screen readers, you're going to be going through and using headers mode and links mode. That's how a lot of people use this type of software. They're going to go through and see what headers are listed, how they are basically creating an outline of the page. And I mean, think about it. When we go through a site, if you're a full-sighted user, you're probably not reading things word by word. They certainly can in the screen reader, but that's going to take forever. So you're just kind of flying through and finding the cues. These are their cues. So it's as simple as making sure your headers are in order. It's one of the first things that will make a validator blow up for accessibility. There's an H4 over here that's hanging out in limbo. It doesn't belong to anything. It should be buried under a 3, which is buried under a 2, which is buried under a 1. It's kind of basic stuff. A lot of times we kind of just ignore it. It's fine, whatever. But you have to, because in this kind of environment, it actually really makes a difference. Skip links. Skip links is something that a lot of people don't think about unless they've been in the accessibility world. Skip link, usually you only have maybe 3 or 4 a page. I'd say that 4 should really be your max. This is where you come in as a link user. This lets me go through, and this is kind of what it would look like. If you go through and I want to add a skip link to my main navigation. So if I was a keyboard user and I hit the tab button, my very first thing that comes up is a focus point, which a visual user wouldn't see this unless they're not using the tab. Or they are using the tab. It lets me go to main content. It skips the nav. Because every single time I reload the page or go to another section, I have to hear the same navigation over and over again. And if you have a lot of links in there, it's going to aggravate me. Another good place, like that we use it in my world with travel, is the filters over like in a right rail situation. If you're searching for a hotel especially, you might get a whole list of all the different hotel names that are available in the area. Imagine, I went through a test at one point and I had to hit tab 147 times before I can get to the main content. I had an argument with people that they didn't want to add the link. I threw a keyboard at them and said, do it. And after they hit that tab button almost 150 times, I won my battle. So, there's just a few places. Just think about it. As you start to use these things, you start to think about it, you can see where it's a natural fit in certain spots. And then, like I've already kind of hit, you need to make sure your keyboard accessible. So you just basically have to go through and make sure you can use your site without your mouse. So obviously this is in a desktop environment, but There's plenty of times where you don't even think about that you have JavaScript that a tab is going to actually create an action that creates a page to reload, and you've put somebody in a loop that they can't progress. Another one, image alt text. This seems ridiculous to have to bring up. This is super old school. But I just recently found a situation where we had somebody go through and strip all the alt tags off of everything and make them all blank. And a lot of the images had contextual meaning. And I don't know why. They just thought that it was a great idea. Cleaned up code. They didn't have to worry about text keys or something. I'm not sure, but it was a really bad idea. When this goes through and it's going to be reading, you're going to lose any meaning that actually holds. So there's 3 good rules to go by. There's a lot of scenarios that you can think about within this kind of idea, but here's the main 3. You want to make sure, obviously, if it has contextual meaning, you have to throw in your alt tag and put in some descriptive text. Don't try and SEO the hell out of it. Just go through and make sure that it's clear, concise, and says what they need to have. If it's decorative, really throw it in your CSS, make it a background image. But if you can't do that, if it's old code, if you're stubborn, you want to make sure you have that image tag in there, then just make sure you have a blank alt tag. You don't want to leave it empty, at least leave it blank. You'll run into issues with your validators if you just leave it, if you completely take it out. And then your third scenario is duplication of information. So if you have a scenario where you have an image that has a caption underneath, you can really just argue that you don't need to add the caption to the alt tag because it's going to be read right after the image when they're going through here. So that's really, you need to think about the user too. You don't want to bombard them with way too much and just make it so it's really hard for them to get through. The only scenario where you would have to make sure you add that alt text in this kind of situation is if they're both wrapped in an individual link tag. If you didn't have the alt text in the image, then that will actually read as link blank, so they have no idea what they're missing. They don't see that it's an image that's right under, over a caption, and that's probably what it belongs to. They have no idea. So you're, again, putting your user in a situation where they're getting lost. Table structure, another basic. Obviously, we know now that everybody's using it for tabular data. The summary and captions are great. Captions usually we keep short, much like a caption underneath an image. Summary, we can add a couple sentences to try and tell a user what this is going to be about. Typically, we have this all hidden, so it's only used for a screen reader. But the biggest thing that a lot of people don't do for some reason and can kind of abuse is the table headers. When you're in a screen reader, you can go into what's called tables mode. So while you're going through the cells, it's telling you if there's vertical and or horizontal headers, it tells you where you are. So if I go to this center block, it's going to tell me I'm in row 3 with blah, blah, blah header, and column 3, and then I'm in row 4, and this is a header, and this is my content. So I know exactly where I am. If I'm a non-visual user, I don't know where the grid lines are. I don't know where I'm falling. And if this is something that I really need to be able to use, then I'm lost. I don't know where I am. So really, it's really basics. It's just making sure you code cleanly. And then one of the big ones that actually really leaves people a little surprised is the links list. So like I mentioned, the screen readers go through, and you can go through headers, mode, or link lists. This is the way that most people are using the screen readers because it's your fast way to go around. Well, think about it. Like in my world, again, travel. If I go and have a flight result, I look at the link list, and I have my navigation links in there. That's great. And then I see flight 57, book, read more, hide, seat map, flight 47, book, click here, hide, book, select. I have no idea what these links are for. They tell me nothing. I may be able to guess because of the fact of where they are, but if I'm going through a list of 100 flights, I don't know which one I need to do, and I shouldn't have to click one, find out I was wrong, go back, find my way back to where I was, and over again. It's just not a good experience. So here, it's really actually an easy fix. It's just making sure that every single link you have has a unique and clear identity. So really what we tend to do is just have hidden text wrapped around, say, something like a book button. So it would say flight 157, book for $450. And you just have a long list of those. It's verbose for the screen reader, but you're not interfering with your visual user. And it's really the best experience you could have set up for everybody. So there's a lot more to go through for accessibility, but those are the ones that we keep seeing come back over and over again. I see that they're kind of rookie mistakes, but they're everywhere. So I wanted to kind of focus on those. But then you think of ARIA. ARIA can add some fantastic things to your, even things like your form validation. If you have some dynamic content, you can have ARIA live on there, so it's actually reading to the screen to the user as content is changing, so they know that something is happening. There are so many facets of this that are just really beneficial. And as new screen reader versions come out and the better browsers are out, it's something to definitely take advantage of. Color contrast, you're going to run into this mainly with level 3 YCAG, but the big one to think about here is placeholder text. A lot of times it's a very light gray within a light gray input box. And that can be really tough for some people to be able to see. It starts to interfere with your design wants and desires, but that's where, if you think about accessibility at the very beginning of a project, you can start to work these things out so you're not just going through and kind of making things ugly at the end. JavaScript accessibility, there's scenarios, think of sliders and calendars and all these different things that require different kinds of inputs. We can go through and make sure that tabs aren't making things refresh like I mentioned earlier. You might be able to add hidden inputs where somebody can actually type in information instead of having to use an access key to move a slider every single number when there's a range of, say, 1,000. That also may create a reload. So you need to think about how somebody's going to be using this. And then landmarks, roles, focus. Focus is a big one. I see a lot of pages that will refresh and they'll throw you back up at the top of the page, or even though it only refreshed a little section. And think of that experience. It's awful. You have to start over and over and over again. And then if you don't have any skip links, I have to go through and tab 150 times every single time I touch a filter. It's horrible. I'm going to go away. And then zooming. Zooming is a good thing to mention, especially for the mobile world. I'm seeing a lot of apps that will actually try and take and disable zooming. And in order to be compliant, you have to allow at least 200% zooming. So there's some things to think about, especially when you're in the mobile environment. Everybody tries to have pretty calendars, fancy ways to set your time or this or that, and they're not using what's actually native to the device. And the one thing you have to think about while you're doing that is that you're also stripping out the native accessibility that's built into the phone. So it's something to really consider, because you may end up spending a lot of time trying to make that fancy thing, end up having to work across the board when it comes down to it, it probably would have been fine even with the default. I know they always have their time and place. And I know I'm probably getting short on time pretty soon, so I wanted to go through a few different testing tools that are out there. There's handfuls, and like I list here down at the bottom, the W3C has a very long list, but these are the ones that we use a lot. The Wave toolbar and accessibility evaluation toolbar in Firefox, which is not my favorite browser to be in, but when I'm there, it saves me from having to open up a screen reader. I'm typically on a Mac, so I have to open up a VM to open up a screen reader. They're clunky. I don't like them. I can see they get in my way. So this is usually what I'll use instead. The good advantage of Wave, it will actually let you see all your ARIA live areas and see how things are interacting, so you can kind of make sure things are working the way you're expecting if you have any bugs. The accessibility evaluation toolbar lets you see your link list and your headers list and a few other things that other plugins allow you to do, but this is really with accessibility in mind, so it's great. This is by far my favorite thing. I actually just found it not that long ago. It's been out for a long time. It has saved us a ton of time. Chrome developer tools and an audit, you can add in some things. I don't use that too much. Color contrast checker is a great tool to add on if you have to deal with a lot of color testing. CynthiaSays.com does, if your site's available externally, then you can run a test through there. It's perfect if you need to scare somebody to worry about accessibility. The reports are ridiculous. They list every warning in detail every single time it runs into it. So if you have to tell somebody they have to worry about it, it will print out a book about this big on the 2-page site. It's really good, though, for you to be able to go through and test all the different levels. And then, just in case everybody hasn't really worked with this at all before, it's probably worth saying the screen readers that are out there. JAWS is the industry standard. I'd say, I think the last time there was a survey, it was around 80–90% on the Windows environment. It's expensive. It's around $1,500–, $1,600 to buy. The licensing says that you're not allowed to use a demo to test. You can make a decision on if you're going to do that or not. But really, the one that has been a great new one for us to use a lot is Windows Eyes. It's free now if you have Outlook on your Windows box. So I assume the usage is going to start to go up on this in the next year or two. There's some great surveys that WebAIM comes out with every year on some accessibility usage. And with those screen readers, you can also go through. It's actually kind of like a vision test mode. You can, again, list your headers, links. You can see these and not just have to listen to them. And then there's a few others. Really, the only other ones I've worked with that much is VoiceOver, obviously on the iPhone and a bit on the desktop. And then something that could really be, it could be a 3-hour talk on its own is maintenance. There's an equation here that's different for everybody that's going to work in their environment. If you're in a small dev shop, you're not going to have many people touching your code. This is going to be a lot more, it's going to be a piece of cake compared to living in the corporate environment where you have tons of people touching it, a lot of people that don't care, nobody felt the pain that you went through to try and make things right. So in the past, what we've done is you can't wrap unit tests around everything, but we went through, and if there was something, say like our calendar used to be killed all the time by somebody, so we would wrap a unit test around that to make sure that it was being tested as a keyboard user, just to make sure, because every single day some of the calendar's broken. Okay, great. So now we made it so that, obviously when they compile, it's yelling at them and not us. Manual testing, it's expensive, it takes time. Like I said, I've had the advantage of working with banks, so they already have these ADA test groups, so we kind of kick it over to them to let them do a lot of the work. We'll go through and step through it a few times, but they go through it many, many times on many different browsers with all different screen readers. But it's necessary. You can't just kind of guess how things are going to be read. Window eyes and JAWS interact differently. VoiceOver works a little bit differently. You'll have different kind of bugs that come up. They treat ARIA tags a little bit differently. And the big advantage that some of the things we've implemented to try and really control this is developer guidelines. It's just added to the process, things that are expected. So basically, if somebody stops paying attention or doesn't look, we can go, hey, see, it says right there, take care of it. And also made sure that our QA, QE people start to know that they have to look at these things to pull up even just the plugins in the browsers and make sure that the ordering makes sense, the wording makes sense. And then just continuing monitoring. Good example is Target. Target was a big target for the NFB, the National Federation of the Blind. They got sued for how they were not accessible. And they fixed it. And rumor is they're in the process of being contacted by them again because they have not maintained their status. That's my time. So something in any kind of new project, it's really worth talking about this. There's a lot of people that need to be involved in this. It's not just the front-end dev. It can be painful, especially in a big environment, but it's necessary. Otherwise, you're really just wasting time. It changes so much that you have to stay on top of it. And then just a couple resources to list out. WebAIM, I think I mentioned them earlier. They have a great survey that comes out every year. I think they just released the Survey 5 a couple months ago. It's also a really good introduction. He has some great writings on there. They also do workshops and whatnot. You can go out to Utah and get a lot of training. I should have listed on here. Nobility U is down in Austin, and they do some good workshops every year, too. I think it's typically in the March timeline. I think it's like a 3-day conference that they have. W3C Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.0. You can go and read that, have a good nap, and pretend you're going to remember a lot of numbers. I actually do know some people you can call, and they'll tell you immediately what it is. I'm not that good at all. Section 508 Gov, that's another standard that's basically covered with all the validation testing you'd be doing. And 2 other places to go for if you need to get some more information is DQ University. It does have a little bit of a cost to it. I think it's a few $100s, but you get it's like 4 or 5 full days of presentations that you get to listen to. And then the SB Bart group has some free webinars online. They're really good introductories. A few of them are pretty in-depth, and I do update them every year because you have to remember, on top of worrying about your code, your standards change every year, and they get stricter and stricter. And if you really need to keep yourself covered, you just have to, it's a great way to kind of keep up with where things are. That's it.